Welcome to Matters Financial and Geopolitical from a Frontier, and thank you kindly for stopping by. It's deeply appreciated. I thank David Williams of CNBC Africa for the interview carried today. We covered a number of issues, the Eurobond, Mumia sugar, real estate prices. I'll put up that link once I've received it. I wrote the following piece over the weekend for the Star. Africa goes to visit Barack Obama in Washington. The White House has invited 50 African heads of state to Washington next week for this first summit between the US and Africa. As many as 200 prominent US CEOs will be on the sidelines of the Washington summit, including the bosses of Walmart, GE, and comments as long ago as last July from Ben Rhodes being the Deputy National Security Advisor for Strategic Communications and Speech Writing, confirm that the US corporate sector is looking to hard charge into Africa. Frankly, we have heard a high demand signal from the US private sector. What we hear from our businesses is that they want to get in the game in Africa, he said last July. President Obama spent less than a day in Africa during the entire first term and is evidently playing catch-up, being the first African-American president of the US at a time when the US was seeking to emerge from a brutal recession. It would have played very poorly back home if the president was seen to be cavorting on the African stage at that time. Therefore, during his first term, President Obama was in a political trap not of his own making with respect to Africa. Of course, the US engagement with Africa has been continuously compared with China's engagement. In 1996, the Chinese committed to a policy known simply as going out and selected Africa as a priority zone for expansion. China overtook the US as Africa's largest trading partner in 2009. Trade rose from $10 billion in 2000 to $210 billion last year. US trade with Africa, but only in goods, not services, totaled $85 billion. In 2013, services amounted to another $11 billion. European trade with Africa reached $137 billion in 2013. China speaks to $400 billion worth of deals in African construction projects, which have already yielded almost 1,400 miles of railroad track and nearly 2,200 miles of highways. In the space of a decade, as Howard French points out, 1 million or more Chinese have emigrated to Africa, buying up land, establishing businesses, plying just about every conceivable trade, from medicine to farming to prostitution. Our goal is not to counter China. Our goal is not to contain China, President Obama said during a trip to Asia earlier this year. On certain levels, we can't or won't compete with China, says the Fund for Peace's Patricia Taft. China will continue to eclipse us in terms of economic interests in Africa. The US is, however, still preeminent in the political sphere, and that influence, she says, will continue to trump anything China can currently offer. Howard French, in his book about Sino-Africa, and I'm interviewing him later on today, says the Chinese see Africa as an El Dorado, a land of opportunity for 1 million migrants. For America, it's a collection of ungoverned spaces, austere locations, failing states, increasingly dominated by local terror groups poised to become global threats, a danger zone to be militarily managed through special operators and proxy armies. In Africa, terrorists, criminal organizations, militias, corrupt officials, and pirates continue to exploit ungoverned and undergoverned territory on the continent and in its surrounding waters, reads the Pentagon's 2014 Quadrennial Defense Review. The potential for rapidly developing threats, particularly in fragile states, including violent public protests and terrorist attacks, could pose acute challenges to US interests. I had the following exchange with a friend, Hoya Wolf, on Twitter last week. Hoya Wolf said energy security and resource access remains the Achilles heel for rising Asian powers. He said this will drive great power competition. Asian powers are positioning to secure upstream energy sources in East Africa, Japan, China, South Korea leading the way. He also said conflict between the US and China would not be decided in the Straits of Taiwan, but from the Straits of Malacca to the Bab el-Mandeb. And I retweeted that point he made about energy, and I said, Ray, the Achilles heel of Asian countries, distant blockade operations and a decisive naval advantage keeps the US ahead of the curve. And he responded by saying, and overwatching it all from Djibouti is the US, and that no superpower would cede its ability to control such important sea lanes. And I agree with him. The point is this from that conversation. The US has an unchallenged hard power position, and it is dominant on the continent via US Africa Command, and has an unchallenged position in its control of the sea lanes. The world has become a great deal more adversarial of late. Look at Ukraine, where NATO is now pressed right up against Putin's face. Look at recent events in the South China Sea, where not too long ago the US flew nuclear-armed B-52s through the ADIZ to make what I felt was a kind of incontestable message. Come closer to home and note that a side effect of toppling the Colonel and his Green Book was that China was essentially expelled from Libya. I appreciate that Africa is in a much better place in this new, more multilateral world. This new multilateral world is much more advantageous for Africa. It has injected some competition into the demand side of our equation. But we need to be cognizant of the hard power disequilibrium because it's intact and set to stay intact for quite a while. With respect to ourselves, I sincerely wish we reset our relations. The rhetoric has veiled the following reality. North America bought 66% of our Eurobond issues. More than 50% of our inward remittances come from North America. We export less than $50 million per year to China. This is a reality that we cannot change, and one that needs to better inform our foreign policy, and urgently. Moving on to home thoughts, I like this stunning picture of Nairobi at sunset taken by Mutua Matheka. Yesterday I tweeted a Dr. Zeus comment which got retweeted for hours. You have brains in your head. You have feet in your shoes. You can steer yourself any direction you choose. You're on your own and you know what you know, and you are the one who'll decide where to go. I've been reading for quite a while. He's extremely dense and packed. Thomas Pynchon Against the Day, and I came across this. They had reached the top of a steep hill, emerging from a stand of maples and black walnuts, some of them already old when Europeans first arrived. The mansion hidden in foliage somewhere below. We all used to come up here in the winter and bobsled down this thing. Back then it seemed damned near vertical, and look at that out there, he nodded westward, through the miles of coal smoke and salt haze. Kit could make out a few semi-visible towers of the city of New York, descended upon by radial shafts of late sunlight from behind, and among clouds that seemed almost their own heavenly prototypes. What photographers called a 2-minute sky, destined rapidly to cloud over and maybe even start dropping some rain. When I came up here by myself, it was to look at the city. I thought there had to be some portal into another world. I couldn't imagine any continuous landscape that would ever lead naturally from where I was to what I was seeing. Of course, it was Queens, but by the time I had that sorted out, it was too late. I was possessed by the dream of a passage through an invisible gate. It could have been a city. It was more a matter of the invisible taking on substance. And that reminded me of a piece I wrote in February 2012 about Wilson Airport, when I said I find Wilson Airport like a magic portal to another world. On that note, I'll put up a photograph of the snow peaks of Mount Kenya that I took more than a year ago, and I still like that photograph. Political Reflections, Jordo149, tweeted, "This looks like a scene from a horror movie, but instead it's Gaza, with the death toll now at more than 1,600. And then another comment, "Instead, the attacks are becoming so common that Israeli military claims of accidental are no longer credible." Israeli politicians have tried to present the shelters as legitimate military targets. Their constant targeting is fueling international outrage. The UN termed the attack a moral outrage and a criminal act. And the usual Israeli lobby expressions of fury at UN criticism are no longer as quick to follow up nor as shrill. Even the United States, normally up for whatever Israel feels like doing, is no longer dancing around such incidents, with the State Department statement lashing the Israeli attack as disgraceful and reiterating that Israel has to stop attacking civilians. Ban Ki-moon called it a moral outrage and a criminal act, and indeed it is. Hamas, this is an article in the New York Times I came across, has changed its doctrine and is using the tunnels as a main method of operation. Israeli troops in Gaza described Hamas gunmen who vanished from one house like magicians and suddenly popped up to fire at them from another. And while Hamas fighters are able to use the tunnels to surprise the forces from behind and to attack those in the rear, Israeli soldiers find themselves having to improvise. We also learnt over the weekend that Israeli intelligence eavesdropped on telephone conversations by the US Secretary of State, John Kerry. Sources told Spiegel the government then used the information obtained from the calls during negotiations in the Mideast conflict. I'll put up a photograph of John Kerry. Mentioned to you that August 4 through August 6 is the US-Africa Leaders Summit, billed by US officials as a first of its kind event. And then somebody's saying President Obama can actually say with a straight face that the trajectory across Africa is towards more democracy, more adherence to rule of law, more transparency, more judicial independence, less corruption. The Chinese guys don't give that speech, Moffat said. I'll put up a photograph of President Obama. He said, "We want to do business with those folks" on Friday at a news conference, meaning Africa. Mike Bloomberg says Africa is the biggest market opportunity in the global economy, and that Africa's GDP will double each of the next 4 decades. Smart companies want to be part of this growth, he said. Joseph Stiglitz is saying we need the right balance between building drone bases and businesses. The big strategic issue facing the US and Africa today is to find the right balance between building new drone bases to fight terrorism and strengthening business relations that sustain mutually beneficial economic and social development. While the US's militaristic emphasis may be understandable, its foreign policy in Africa should shift significantly towards support for trade, finance, and cultural cooperation, he says. Interesting piece on Bloomberg about Africa's military moves by the US, reflecting Iraq and Afghan wars. More than 3 years after killing Osama bin Laden and claiming that the core of Al-Qaeda had been decimated, the Obama administration is waging a protracted war with his disciples across North and Sub-Saharan Africa. The enemy isn't a nation or an alliance, but a diverse, mobile, adaptive collection of groups loosely united by the goal of overthrowing the region's governments and replacing them with strict Islamic rule. Militants returning to the continent after fighting in the Middle East are linking up with local groups and attacking governments in the continent already struggling to control their territories, says retired US Army General Carter Ham. These borders might as well not exist, he said, of the poorest region, Libya, Tunisia, Niger, Algeria. Militants are thriving in northern Africa's weak, ungoverned spaces, and more of them are returning from Syria and Iraq with battlefield experience and credibility. Very interesting article. Do have a look at it if you get a chance. I'll put up a poster displayed along the road showing a photograph of the leader of the militant Islamist group Boko Haram in Nigeria. I'll put up a graphic of the US military in Africa. The Economist is saying Africa is set to deliver a fresh asymmetric shock to the global order, taking its place as the last great emerging market. I agree with that. Javier Blas of the FT has posted an interesting infographic showing how US-Africa oil trade has hit a 40-year low after the shale revolution. And then finally, on political reflections, a US reconnaissance plane crosses into Sweden to avoid Russians. This is an article in the New York Times. Currency markets, the euro 134.25. Dollar index didn't get more of a push higher. It's already rallied towards the top of the range, last at 81.33. Keeping an eye on it. Japanese yen 102.64. Swiss franc 0.9063. Pound, that slipped considerably now at 168.26. Aussie 0.9322. India rupee 60.83, South Korean won 1031.65, Rial 225.70, Egyptian pound where it's been for a great deal of time 715.21, and the South African rand 1065.36. I'll put up a 3-month chart of the dollar index, a 1-year chart of the dollar index, and really to get very bullish we've got to get above that 2014 that 12-month high that you can see on the chart around 82.50. Euro dollar 134.25. We've been slipping for a while, but we seem to have found small support around here. Gold 1292.925. I'm of the opinion we'll see a stronger dollar and we'll see gold fall away to 1250. Crude oil at $97.94. I think it's a trading buy. I'm looking at it, but waiting for now. Coming to Africa, Africans see jobs, education and security as their biggest areas of concern. This is a poll on Monday conducted by One. Ebola fear prompts South Korean University to cancel Nigerians' invitation. The Duksung Women's University in Seoul said in a statement the school politely withdrew its invitation for 3 Nigerian students to attend an international conference that it is co-hosting with the United Nations starting from Monday. Ambassador Mina Mohammed tweeted this photograph at State House with His Excellency Uhuru Kenyatta, Yoweri Museveni, Salva Kiir, Haile Mariam Desalegn and William Ruto. South African all-share fell 0.93% on Friday, but it remains 10.0765% higher this year. Dollar rand, I'll put up a 6-month chart, last at 1065.36. Egyptian pound at 715.19. Egyptian stock market ticked 0.27% lower on Sunday, but it remains Africa's best this year. It's up 29.784%. Nigeria all shares slipped 0.39% on Friday, but it remains 1.463% higher this year. Interesting comment I picked up from Bloomberg. The use of suicide bombers, particularly female, and remember there were 3 female suicide attackers in Ghana not too long ago, is behind a rapidly rising rate of mass casualty attacks and targeted assassination attempts. The chart of the day from Bloomberg shows how US imports of Nigerian crude have almost converged with American sales of refined petroleum cargoes like gasoline and kerosene shipped in the opposite direction. Ghana Stock Exchange up 7.272% in 2014, and they have, according to reports, turned to the IMF for help. Actually, I was on an interview with the BBC on Friday night, and I said he's got to pick up the phone to Lagarde. Glad to see he's done that, because really it was getting a little bit silly. The Ghanaian currency, of course, has been the worst performing currency in the world. They've been running a fiscal deficit without getting on top of it. I think the best thing that they could have done is what they've done. And I wrote about this in June when I said, look at Ghana, where the president, John Mahama, claims he is looking for a homegrown solution to a situation of his making, and frankly, there isn't one. Ernst & Young have posted an infographic about which countries are emerging as the new FDI hotspots in Africa. And then an interesting piece from the World Bank about how 1 in every 20 jobs in Africa involves tourism and the travel industry, talking in particular about how Mozambique has managed a seemingly impossible transformation of its tourism industry. Lots of interesting data in there. Well worth looking at. It's linked on Rich Wrap-Ups. Investment in Angolan banking may prove a crippling deal for Portugal, for Banco Espírito Santo. Oil-producing Angola provided a lifeline during a euro debt crisis that weakened its economy so much that the country had to negotiate an international bailout in 2011. Banco Espírito Santo, however, Angola has turned out to be a crippling investment, one that could require the government in Lisbon to do damage control with the government in Luanda. Banco Espírito Santo allowed its subsidiary in Angola, which is a former Portuguese colony, to hand out at least 5.7 billion euros, or about $7.7 billion in loans. That amount is equivalent to 220% of the subsidiary's deposits. The Portuguese parent appears to be in no position to retrieve those loans without the support of the Angolan state. And it's been high drama indeed. A very interesting article, well worth reading in full to get a better idea of what's been going on. Coming here to Kenya, the government, according to the president, is boosting spending on security after decades of severe underinvestment, and wants to work more closely with the international community to help defeat the threat posed by terrorism. This is President Kenyatta in an August 2nd interview at State House in the capital, Nairobi. He rejected calls by opposition leader Raila Odinga for the withdrawal of Kenyan forces from Somalia because he said it may lead to an onslaught similar to the one by Boko Haram militants in northeast Nigeria. It is those types of actions pulling out of Somalia that can ultimately result in a Boko Haram type environment in Kenya, Kenyatta said. That is what we're determined to ensure doesn't succeed. The raids in Kenya have scared off tourists who contribute more than $1 billion in Kenya's FX earnings, the second largest after tea exports. Arrivals of holidaymakers fell 18% to 1.4 million last year. World Bank lowered its forecast for Kenya's economic growth this year and next to 4.7%. The asymmetric threat, which is best exemplified in that photograph I took that day of Westgate on fire, which I'll now post, it was 314 days ago, interestingly enough, remains a very potent threat. Centum closed at a record on Friday. It has rallied 44.696% this year. Share price data is on the website, is on Rich Wrap-Ups. KCB Group is at a record high, plus 15.34% this year. If you didn't see the first half earnings release, there's a link for you on the website. If you didn't get a chance to watch Mind Speak, please, there's another link for that as well. He really was an inspirational guest and fired up the audience. Kenya shilling was last at 87.80. Nairobi all shares plus 12.0965 in 2014, and had a very sharp move high on Friday, up 0.98%. I'll put up a photograph I took with Peter Mwangi, the CEO of the NSE. That IPO is currently current. NSE 20 rallied 0.74% and turned into positive territory for the year. EABL taps spirits to recoup revenue lost in cake price rise. An investor presentation by Diageo CEO Ivan Menezes indicated the decision to use spirits to target the low end is based on doubts that the Treasury would review its decision to raise taxes on Senator Keg. In East Africa, we're using Jebel Gold to reach value-conscious consumers. Accelerating the launch of the brand helped offset some of the weakness on Senator Keg as we rolled it out using our bespoke Senator route to consumers in Kenya, said Mr. Menezes. EABL is expected to release its full-year results next week. The share price has rallied sharply after hitting a low in 2014 around March. It's going to cross 300 imminently, and I'm looking forward to see how they've got on. That will be interesting, and as we get close to the time, I'll warn you about those full year results. Once again, I do appreciate the fact that you stopped by in your busy day. I am grateful for that, I really am.